And we also have in common with NATO an almost
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Digital Forensic Research Lab's Senior Fellow. Would you kindly take your seats? We are about to continue. We are about to continue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hi everyone, I hope you're sitting down, ready for the next session. I'm impressed that you're all still here and glad, because the next session that we've got is one of the most important topics that NATO has yet to really grapple with, and that is how to deal with disinformation, the panoply of hybrid techniques that are being used against the West. But disinformation is an area that we've seen in recent years, particularly here in the UK after the Salisbury attacks. And so we are going to be hearing from experts about fake news, disinformation, how to spot that and how to counter it. But before that, we're going to have a bit of an audience quiz from GlobSec. So if you could all get your phones out, because I think you're going to have to be a bit interactive. And I'd like to welcome onto the stage the GlobSec Strategic Communication Programme Senior Research Fellow, Katerina Klingova, who will lead the session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Katarina. I'm from Slovakia, and I have a quiz for you. So please do take out your cell phones, and yes, it's allowed now. Go to the section Interactive, and let's see what's your knowledge about the problems that we face as researchers in order to overcome disinformation. So the first things that we have to overcome in our work are public perceptions. So my first question to you is, on average, how many Central Europeans think that NATO and US-led coalition supported terrorists in Syria? It's A, 22%, B, 26%, C, 31%, or D, 40%. What do you think? This is actually one of the questions that we polled back in 2018. We do our own polling, GlobeSec Trends, in order to find out how widespread is disinformation in Central Europe. And we found out that a lot of Central Europeans believe in conspiracy theories. 53% of Slovaks believe in conspiracy theory that there are totalitarian, secret societies aiming to establish totalitarian world order. But then we get a lot of data on the perceptions of threat. And this year we found out there are huge differences about the perception of threats among the Central Europeans. So, for example, there are 41% of Slovaks who think that United States pose a threat to their national security, in comparison to only 12% of Poles who think similarly. But let's go back to your polling and see how did you vote it. Okay, so majority of the people voted for D, and actually that's not correct answer. On average it's just 26%, but actually 40% of Slovaks, which is D, think that NATO and US-led coalition supports terrorism in Syria. So these kind of conspiracy theories and disinformations are very widespread about NATO in Central Europe. Okay, so let's go to our next question. How many websites have been identified by a group of independent researchers as spreading malign, disinformative, and conspiratorial content in Slovakia and Czech Republic? It's A, 118, B, 150, C, 162, or D, 180 websites. What do you think? I mean, we are a country of 5 million, and we're unique in the sense that we have a website that collects a list and provides a list of disinformation websites. It's called Conspiratori.sk. It's a project of PR agencies, and they basically rank any kind of website. It doesn't have to be disinformative or informative on the scale of 0 to 10, and if a website scores number 5 or over 5, they're considered to be spreading malign or disinformation content. So what are your results? Let's see, how did you vote it? Yes, correctly. There are 162 disinformation websites being listed in this database at the moment. And unfortunately, the numbers are rising, constantly rising. Okay, so next questions. In February 2017, a video of the transfer of military convoy of Allied forces through eastern part of Slovakia was spread with the disinformation narrative of preparation of NATO's invasion. How many people do you think saw this video within 24 hours? Was it 150,000, 575,000, 935,000, or over 1.3 million? It's 5 million country, it's 2017, so not a lot of bots and trolls, but we see a lot of disinformation being spread, especially when there's a NATO convoy passing Slovakia. So what do you think? Okay, let's see how you voted. Okay. Can we have the slide about the voting? Nobody voted? Almost. It was only 935,000, but it was 3 times as much as usually the Slovak video bloggers get when they post a video. So it became very viral and was pushed by those over 100 disinformation websites. Okay, next question. What is the ratio between the budget European Union set for detection of disinformation and the budget of the Russian state-sponsored media allocated for 2020? It's 1 to 6, 1 to 60, 1 to 160, or 1 to 260. As we know, I know I'm speaking a lot about Russians, but in my region, in Central region, it's predominantly Russian disinformation. I mean, China was mentioned several times in here, but still in Central Europe, it's predominantly Russian disinformation that is spread by a lot of disinformation websites or actors. Okay, let's see the results. It's not correct. The correct answer is 1 to 260. 260. I mean, in the next slide, you're going to see where some of the money is being allocated. In real time, it's 5 million to 1.3 billion euros. So yeah, it's 1.2, its ratio is 1 to 260. Okay, next question is going to be on online advertisement. According to the Global Disinformation Index study, what was the value of advertisements that were posted on 20,000 disinformation websites? Was it 150 million, 235 million, 300 million, or 325 million that were posted in 1 year on these 20,000 disinformation websites? What do you think? Monetary incentives are very, attractive for various actors to spread disinformation, and it's a good business eventually. Yes. Well, yeah, you guys have the correct answer. Almost 1/4 billion worth ads was posted on disinformation websites. So a lot of money is making a lot of actors is making a lot of money on disinformation. But the good thing is that there are lots of good practices that we can share among each other. There are lots of good practices how we have been countering disinformation and hybrid threats, and we need to share them because we are NATO and we are stronger together. Thank you for your attention, and I'm going to yield the floor to my colleague, Jakub, who's going to be ready with a different presentation and different quiz.
Ladies and gentlemen, please now welcome to the stage the Digital Forensic Research Lab's Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council, Jakub Kalenski.
Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Jakub Kalenski, and I work for the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, where we focus on identifying, exposing, and explaining hostile information manipulation, and we do it by using open source data. Within this very short time frame, I can't really describe everything that we're doing with the Atlantic Council on exposing disinformation, so I have one very, very short case study. You have a model situation: Russia denies something. In this case, they denied that their military contingents would be present in Venezuela. The speculations that Russians are in Venezuela have been there already last year, but it was only in March when we received some pictures which were supposedly proving that they are there. Now, how do you verify that they are there? First, you can rely on the experts. You can consult one of the most knowledgeable accounts on Twitter, which is Darth Putin KGB, who tells you do not believe anything until the Kremlin denies it. Kremlin has denied that the Russians are in Venezuela, so it must be true. And you would be right, but there is a more reliable, although a bit longer way. That's what we are doing. And in this case, we actually use the technique of geolocation. So we took the picture and compared it to Google Maps. On the left, you see the picture from the internet, and on the right, you see Google Maps. And as you can see, we highlighted the pole in the green, the fence in the yellow, the parking slot for the cars in the blue, and the red roofed building in the red. And then there are some more pictures of exactly this plane and the soldiers there. And as you can see in detailed pictures, they are wearing desert camouflage, meaning they were probably flown directly from Syria. So we were able not to locate them only on one specific airport, but we were actually able to locate the Russian soldiers at exactly one hotel in Venezuela. Please mark the columns and the semicircular roof above the columns. Here you could actually see it on a bigger picture. The columns, the brown umbrellas, and the semicircular roof, very distinctive shape. And you can see this very distinctive shape at exactly one hotel in Venezuela. So on the left, you would see the picture from Google Earth, and it is this hotel, Hotel Círculo Militar in Fortuna. One more quick example. This is Legacy Strategic Services. This is a private military company, quite similar to the better-known Wagner Group that is run by so-called Putin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin. And we were trying to trace where this private military company is located in Syria. Again, we worked with pictures acquired via social media, and there you can see that the comment said that we should be looking in the proximity of Aleppo. And there is actually just one area near Aleppo with the exact location of the fenced area and those two buildings and the road there. Now, in more detail, you see the bigger building highlighted in the blue, the smaller building highlighted in the green, and you can see the road on the left. And it's exactly this area that you can see on the map near Aleppo. One more picture, here you can see the road better. It is exactly the location of the buildings and of the road. Now, further digging through open source data can actually reveal some more surprising information. So we looked up the address of Legacy Strategic Services, and then we were looking for people who actually who are on the social media admitting that they work for this company. And we have found this gentleman called Anatoly Smolin, the director of Legacy Strategic Services. And I think you wouldn't guess where he looks for the recruits for his private military company. It is a dating website. Find your Ukrainian beauty. So he was looking for recruits at this website, but apparently he was quite successful. He has found some beauties, and there you can see him on the picture in Syria conducting a training for the local Syrian fighters. So as you can see, working with open source data might be a bit of fun and might be a bit of surprising, but the main reason we are doing it is actually to protect the facts against those who are trying to undermine them, and thus to protect democracy and its institutions. So if you like this work, please follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our newsletter, read it and share it with your audiences and help us do our work. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please now welcome to the stage Director of the Global Focus Centre, Oana Popescu-Zamafea.
Good evening, everyone. And as I gather from your previous questions, this is the session that you've all been waiting for. Because a lot of the questions have been about disinformation and interference. And I think the reason this session is particularly relevant is that we're all here today looking at the alliance, NATO, founded to counter, to prevent conventional, unconventional threats, and to essentially protect us against conflict, war. But the thing is, much of what we'll be facing in the future, in the very near future, is not going to be called conflict, it's not going to be called war, and very likely it's going to not necessarily come from our enemies, but it's going to come from within. It's going to use our own populations against us, it's going to use our own governments against us, and very often we're not even going to be aware that this happens. I have here today Mr. Rand Waltman, Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Senior Information Scientist from Rand Corporation, and Carl Miller, Research Director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, trying to sort this out for you. And I think, you know, what I'm going to start with, just asking you, gentlemen, to perhaps focus your remarks on, your initial remarks, is these threats, whatever we call them, that we're being faced with, they're not necessarily manufacturing. It's not about manufacturing problems. It's not about somebody creating problems for us. It's just about somebody using problems that we have already and that we have created. So maybe if you can focus some of your initial remarks on the question, well, how is an alliance that was founded and conceived to defend us against our enemies going to do a good job in defending us against ourselves? So please, if any of you wants to take this up, I'll be very happy to hear.
All right, well, let me begin then. Well, firstly, hello everyone, thank you so much for having me here. The good news is that if NATO doesn't do something about this, then we truly are lost. This is the alliance which desperately needs to step into this problem. I'll begin, I'll deal with your point, but let me begin just by stepping back. So, over the last 10 years or so, several things have happened which have all come together. Firstly, information has become so much more central. So data, information, the idea, it's changed almost every different social and economic part of life that we can imagine. And it also has kind of been brought into the heart of what militaries think warfare is as well. So information has always been used in war. It's always been an important part of conflict. But I would say over the last 10 years, something else has happened. And this is point number one. Militaries have kind of made this conceptual flip. And rather than see information as a tool of war, it's seen information as a space which war happens within, as a domain of war, which is alongside air, sea, land, and space, and so on. So it's a domain, a conflict area. So militaries around the world, both liberal, democratic, and autocratic, have all pivoted to begin to fight and indeed win in this new domain. I think that is one of the first and most important things that's happened. Secondly, just as militaries were doing this anyway, we saw the rise of these new online social spaces which were open, they were anonymous, they were frictionless, and they were the new battlegrounds where we were all fighting our various political and electoral races, of course social media. Easy for anyone to join, where no one knows who anyone else is, easy to game, easy to be reverse engineered, and where people are increasingly turning to in order to learn more and more about social and political life. Right now in the UK, of course, as we near our own election, we have the politicians desperately fighting on social media spaces just as they're out there on the street. And those two things then came together. So just as militaries were pivoting to understand their new role in a world where war was being fought within information, just as online spaces were rising, we saw the rise of what I would call dark influence, for want of a better word. Sometimes it was coordinated, inauthentic networks, sometimes it was fake accounts, sometimes it was the amplification of mainstream news stories, sometimes it was really targeted campaigns. This was when militaries began to reach through these online spaces in order to have various kinds of attitudinal or behavioral effects in countries around the world as an extension of their own geopolitical strategies. Now, this wasn't necessarily fake news. It wasn't necessarily even disinformation. Like, more often than not, this was about cherry-picking perfectly true stories to create a very distorted picture of the world and making people angry about things that they already believe. It wasn't necessarily about lying to people, but it was about changing what they thought and what they saw. And then, so over the last 10 years, we've seen this break out in almost every single election and major political and social event that has happened all over the world. Now, sometimes that spotlight shines on the US election, sometimes it shines in the UK, but it's a hell of a lot worse if you're in Georgia or Estonia, and it's happening not just on Twitter and Facebook, but on pretty much every online platform that you can imagine. It's happening, I mean, we did an investigation to expose it happening on Wikipedia, it's happening on SoundCloud, it's happening on WhatsApp, it's happening on TikTok, happening almost everywhere online. And then lastly, if I have enough time, then, as we saw this new kind of conflict break out, we're now facing this situation where it's a kind of warfare which increasingly we feel is gripping our own societies, and we have no idea what to do about it. The tech giants and civic society are talking more about digital literacy, which by itself really won't work. Governments aren't really even able, I think, to define this problem, and everywhere we're scratching our heads because offense is so much easier to do than defense. We haven't even begun to talk about de-escalation of information warfare. We haven't even really understood what can be effective in countering the existence of these campaigns.
Carl, thank you very much. And before I turn to the next speaker, I just want to make two very brief notes about what you just said. One, we actually did 2 studies at the Global Focus Center focusing on this demand side, on what we don't do enough that would prepare us for resisting malign interference. And the studies were in the Western Balkans and the Black Sea region. And one of the major findings was that members of NATO had very, very similar weaknesses with non-members of NATO. So, you know, and I throw this question to you, turning back to the role of the alliance, then what good is it? I mean, are we actually protected? Does NATO protect us from malign interference as well? Is this something, is this a purpose it can serve?
Well, at the moment, I would say nobody is protecting us. I mean, governments of Europe and the United States have decided to leave their populations essentially undefended at this point, as far as I can tell. There are many reasons for that we could go into, but at some point you have to stop admiring the problem and actually start doing something about it. And so far, we've gotten to the point where people are at least willing to listen to what the problem is, but I don't think we've gotten to the point that people are actually willing to take any actual positive action. And the point about the action is that this is the kind of thing which you cannot solve in a passive way. This requires proactive type activities. So you have to actively message people. You have to actively, you can't, for example, so you can't counter disinformation really. You have to displace it. And in order to displace it, I mean, this is just the way people's minds work. In order to displace it, you have to provide something to displace it with. So one of the problems that we face is who is actually going to decide what narratives you would like to be out there as opposed to the ones that you don't like to be out there. It isn't enough to just say, this is a bad narrative. You have to say what you would like to be and make sure that you somehow get that out there. And that requires action. So building up resilience is also a question of being proactive and putting out narratives. And so then offensive is also putting out narratives, being proactive. So in both cases, building resilience and an offense, you have to be active.
But is this something for governments to do? Is this something for nation states to do? Does this require a supranational, international response? And, you know, last of all, especially when you look at countries in Central Eastern Europe, do we feel safe for our governments to address this? Because again, going back to the studies that we did, very often the governments are actually part of the problem, not of the solution. So do we trust them to actually do anything good about this?
I mean, I think we need a new kind of informational mutual defence clause. I mean, I think the problem, the gap, is that our kind of legal and international architecture has not kept up with the threats that populations face. I think it's pretty much as simple as that. So, you know, states are now kind of interfering and extending geopolitical influence in ways which none of our mutual defence anythings are actually defining or therefore allowing us to collectively counter. Now, you're absolutely right. Like, governments and political parties and heads of state are also doing a huge amount of this too. Like, that's part of the problem. But civic society cannot tackle this alone, and they are basically being the only part of society which is actually mobilised to actually try and deal with this.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, it cannot do that alone. But I'm looking at protests from Hong Kong to Lebanon to Chile to Europe. And the thing is, clearly political parties have probably lost their power of representation, and institutions of representative democracy have not kept up with the social changes. So can they actually address this problem within the framework of representative democracy? Or do we risk that just like people go out into the street, they will go out on social media, they will go out and trust people in churches, in all sorts of congregations, and they will not trust the institutions of representative democracy?
Well, the institutions have to build up trust. So you have to establish trust somehow. If you don't do that, then you can't really do much of anything.
But we are at an all-time low of trust in institutions.
Well, but the question is how much effort has really been put into building up trust?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so I would posit that really not much effort has been put into that.
But, I mean, look, the current, like, kind of solution toolkit that we currently talk about is unbelievably narrow. I mean, people basically either dwell on digital literacy training, which will reach people in formal education and might have
Is
some...
this an illusion? Is this...
Yeah. I mean,
are we entertaining the illusion that if we inform people and educate them, they will be bright and smart and resist this themselves?
It's the fuzzy, warm solution which doesn't tangle with any of the, arrangements and divisions of power which we currently have. The tech giants love it, and it might have some effect in 10 years' time of the people that have gone through it. But it's clearly going to be inadequate until then. So it's either that, or the other thing that people talk about is like direct governmental intervention at the content level into online platforms.
Ooh.
So, well, right.
I mean, that's
right. Which
I already feel like leaving.
Which is offensive to Liberal Democrats for an entirely understandable and completely different reason. Now, the one thing that we don't ever talk about when it comes to trying to solve online kind of information warfare or illicit influence is platform engineering. We never talk about platform engineering. So the reason, like Facebook and Twitter and all these platforms are designed largely to do one thing, which is to grow as large as possible. And that means growth within the tech giants has been the most dominant, most powerful team that you can imagine. What growth wants to happen within those platforms basically has happened over the last 10 years. And that means that all online platforms that we use basically share one characteristic, which is frictionlessness. It's very, very easy to join. They're very easy to do stuff on. And you volunteer very little information to do with your identity or anything else when you do stuff on there. And that's all because they're designed to grow. Now, we might, as a society, at some point, come to a decision that platforms which are central to our social and political lives aren't best served by platforms that are also designed to grow as large as possible.
Except also, I will interrupt you because, one, we like comfort. As consumers, as people, we like comfort, so we will go for whatever is easy. And then the other thing is democracy itself is a slow-moving animal, okay? I mean, democracy does not offer the same kind of smooth, frictionless process, and that's perhaps the beauty of it. So before starting taking questions from the audience, I will just ask you, is building resilience enough? Is it enough to strengthen ourselves so that we would be more resilient? Or do we also need a form of response? Do we need to clearly identify who's doing this to us and try to target those individuals or entities?
Well, at the end of the day, I think the best thing is to build resilience. That's where you're going to be strongest. Because if the population is sufficiently resilient, then these kind of efforts by at least foreign influence can be resisted. The problem is that you have equal amounts of influence, maybe even worse, by domestic operators. Mm-hmm. So I would say, for example, in most countries, domestic operations by domestic operators are a much bigger problem or a bigger threat than by foreign influence. Mm-hmm. So somehow you have to get that under control.
Well, because we have 6 minutes and a half, I'm going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to take 3 at once, and please speak in tweets. Over there, on the right-hand side first, there's a lady.
Hi, I'm a behavioral economist working in international security from the Institute for European Studies and Women in International Security. So you talked about building resilience. What does building resilience actually look like? Because when we're talking about increasing defense spending and specifically NATO being agile and active in the digital age, what can we actually do to build resilience and combat, not counter, disinformation campaigns?
Okay, so how do we build resilience? Let's take a second question as well. Here, just in front.
Borsruger, Munich Security Conference. Rand, you spoke about internal actors, but isn't that a false dichotomy? We have internal actors, but we have external actors who are amplifying those messages that are so divisive. So how can you draw a line between those and say those are two separate categories completely?
So how do we differentiate? And then we have a third question just behind you. Please put up your hand.
Hello, it's Razin here again, founder of HydroGo, focused on biotechnology and AI. So my question was that, you guys are talking about, disinformation and everything, but how do we adopt a Bayesian way of thinking to basically identify the signal from the noise? So, probably to incorporate a probabilistic way of thinking, would that be the case? And how do you incorporate that as an innate instinct within the demographic? Thank you.
Okay, so since I asked for the questions to be delivered in tweets, please answer in tweets as well.
Well, so first to your question, I don't actually draw a hard distinction, because you could have domestic operations which are supported by foreign influence, who the domestic operations have to serve their interests. You could have foreign originated operations, which I think is much actually of less consequence, probably. But yes, so you can't really separate those out. But if you're going to get at those kinds of things, you have to get at the domestic operators, because if the domestic operators weren't taking action, then the foreign, where they're going to play off of? There wouldn't be anything there. So it's still, you still have to focus on the domestic operations.
I think there was also the question about how do you build resilience? Because
so building resilience has to do with proactively putting out strong narratives that you find that are favorable to the society. So if you put out strong narratives, I mean, people are, cognitive psychology makes people resistant to changing narratives. So if you have strong narratives to start with, it's difficult to change them. And the stronger they are, the harder it is to change, and that translates into resilience. But in order to do that, you have to first decide what narratives you want to put out there, and then you have to actually put them out.
Okay.
This is an area where me and my colleague here probably massively disagree. I simply don't think this is a problem of counter-narratives. We're dealing with platforms that want to serve you up the most engaging content possible to keep you on their platform. Now, what kind of content is that likely to be? It's content which will make you really angry about stuff, or it's stuff which is really funny. Basically, it's usually one of those two things. Now, outrage is the easiest way to manipulate people. You will share whatever makes you outraged across social media like it's going out of fashion. You will react to that in ways you don't react to almost any other content. And that's why on campaign after campaign that we pull apart, day in, day out, outrage is the one consistent factor.
So what do we do about it?
You change platform engineering. Like the reason that these things, I mean, partly this is to do with who we are as human beings. There's nothing we can do to change that. But we don't want these platforms to essentially echo our own cognitive psychological defects in the decisions that they make about what information to surround us with.
And can we genuinely stand in the way of technological advancement and the people's preferences? I mean, we're going to do that. Aren't we going to be faced with a new challenge and a new challenge?
These aren't people's preferences. These are commercial decisions which companies have made around how their platforms work in order to get bigger. These are not people's preferences at all. And the idea that we can't implement kind of democratic values into the platforms which have become central to our societies, I think is probably one of the most dangerous ones, which is currently washing around the policy debates on this.
Okay.
Well, so actually another thing that you can do, which I think would be a reasonable idea, is to create so take NATO, for example, to create its own, a national public or international public social media platform, where you then have complete transparency, you have complete control, and then you can, and not only that, but everybody can contribute to solutions equally. Because right now with the platforms, for example, they're businesses, and whatever they say they're doing, you don't actually know that they're doing anything that they say because they won't actually show you. So, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is not an elected public official, and looking to him to solve the problem, I think, is a big mistake. Right? If you want to solve the problem, then you do something like we did with CERN. In CERN, right, people got together, all countries got together, contributed money, and built an accelerator. Okay? You do the same thing. Everybody get together, you build a public social media platform which provides all the transparency and all the information that you need.
Because just before you intervene, because it's fashionable, can I see a show of hands of how many of you actually believe technology is your ally, our ally, in dealing with malign interference, and how many believe it's an enemy? So first of all, how many believe it's your ally in fighting malign interference? Okay, wow, that sounds overwhelming. And your enemy? Technology is your enemy. Okay, that's quite hopeful.
Well, no, it's both. It is both, you're right.
Very, very last words, because we have 20 seconds.
So society, partly as a result of these influence campaigns, we think, or anyway, societies are becoming angrier, they're becoming more split, they're becoming more paralysed. That's why we've done nothing about it here in the UK. Countries are becoming further apart. International cooperation is becoming more difficult. This is clearly something which cannot be dealt with on a nation-state per nation-state basis. NATO is, and this is the reason it's so important to talk about this in front of you all, NATO is one of the few institutions left that is the glue between nation states around the world, which allows that kind of cooperation to happen.
So
if NATO cannot step in to help us deal with disinformation, we are going to have a very, very rocky next 10 years.
So a trans-border problem, trans-border solutions. Rand, would you agree or add anything to this?
To what? Huh?
So it's a trans-border problem which requires trans-border solutions.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Nobody can solve this by themselves. Within one country, it can't be a civilian or it can't be a government thing alone or an industrial thing alone. Globally, it can't be one country alone. It has to be trans-border, absolutely.
Thank you very much. I think this was probably the fastest paced session. And I hope you got at least part of the answers that you were looking for. Thank you very much to the speakers as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, please now welcome to the stage lecturer in international relations at Leicester University, Blevin Bowen.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk to you today about outer space and what it means in the military context, given that NATO is about to officially declare outer space as a new operational domain for the alliance. What I'm going to do is hopefully give you some meaningful context as to what that means and also portray an accurate picture of the realities of military operations in outer space. And we'll hopefully touch on the issue of weaponization as well, which is never far away in media commentary on this issue, and something you'll probably hear a lot about in the news in the weeks ahead. NATO is about to declare outer space as an operating domain for the military. And this essentially brings NATO up to speed with what some of the larger member states of NATO have in practice done for decades, and in the case of Britain and France have put into writing in more recent years. So the United States Air Force has been talking about space as a military domain or an operational domain since the 1980s, the early 1980s. And Britain and France have recently followed suit. Britain has seen a lot of activity with new space doctrines and new policies and space security policies being published as well. And what this means essentially is that there's a recognition now in the NATO alliance formally that space is essential for military operations and for tactical and operational uses of military power. So rather than just strategic uses of space technology for slow burn intelligence, imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, it is now useful on the battlefield. And this is not new. Space being arguably decisive on the battlefield or essential goes back in the United States to at least the 1991 Gulf War. So this is a formal recognition really within NATO that space is essential for warfare, and therefore in a time of war, it is not unreasonable to expect those space systems to come under some form of attack or denial or disruption because of their utility in military operations. So one of the words that's bandied about in talking about outer space and military issues is space militarization. Indeed, one of the questions I got for this talk, or the prompts, was, should space be militarized? And that's like trying to close the barn door after the horse has bolted. Space began as a military realm. If it wasn't for the military applications of ICBMs and rockets to deliver nuclear weapons and to deploy spy satellites and communication satellites for military purposes, we would not have seen the massive amounts of investment in space technologies in the 1950s and 60s in the superpowers of the Cold War, and also amongst other European states and other countries like China and India as well. So space has always been a military realm. So talking about whether space is being militarized is something of a misconception, really. So we shouldn't be too alarmist about these sorts of declarations, because space began as a military environment. It's always been an environment that has been used primarily for military purposes. And scientific and commercial exploitation of space is something that has come after the initial military and intelligence exploitations of space. So space has always been a military realm. Weaponization then, in some of the initial press releases already, it seems NATO has had to say there are no plans to weaponize space. And one of the realities is that to engage in space warfare, you don't need to put weapons in space. So if you are afraid that putting weapons in space will allow space warfare to happen, you're missing the real fact, the strategic reality that you can engage in forms of space warfare with weapon systems that are based on Earth and not always those that are based in orbit. So anti-satellite weapon systems are proliferating. The United States, China, Russia and India all have kinetic or physical anti-satellite weapon systems program. Russia, I believe, is still the only one that hasn't tested one in recent years. But there are many other forms of attacking space infrastructure that are so-called soft kill mechanisms, like electronic warfare or computer network operations or computer network infiltration, what is fashionably called cyber. So there are many other ways of doing space system attacks, and they can happen on the ground, or they can happen with systems that are based on Earth that point up into space. So worrying about space weaponization has to be put in the context that we can wage space warfare now, at least from the perspective of the major powers of the international system, without putting weapons in space. So with that background, essentially my understanding of NATO now getting more interested in space as an operating domain means NATO has to figure out what its member states can do to better integrate and coordinate the rather disparate space capabilities of especially the European member states. There's a lot of complementarity in some member states. Different member states have different kinds of sovereign space capabilities in military satellite communications, intelligence capabilities, and various other space services as well. So NATO does have a role in trying to figure out where can spending be better allocated amongst its member states to try and combine the total space power assets that are within the NATO alliance, because put together, NATO has by far the highest number of space systems available. So a good chunk of those over 2,000 active satellites that are now in space are owned by or registered in NATO member states. So there's a lot of thinking to be done there with NATO as to what it can do to better align those disparate European member states' capabilities in space. So I will leave my comments there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I think we have time for just to probe you on one point. How difficult is attribution in space? This is something we spent a lot of time wondering about in hybrid scenarios. What do little green men look like in space?
Yes, good question. So if it's a big hard kill weapon system event, so if it's a ramming vehicle that is shot up into space, that is quite easy to attribute. Things like cyber attacks or computer network operations, they are harder as any form of cyber attack would be. So the fact that it's going into a satellite control system doesn't change the fact that it can be hard to attribute. Electronic warfare, a lot of that happens unintentionally every day as normal operations within the radio frequency spectrum, unless it's very high-powered jamming, and the longer it goes on, the easier it becomes to identify and track it as well. But things at the beginning of a crisis with soft kill methods can be harder to attribute, but a big, spectacular hard kill incident should be fairly easy to attribute thanks to physics.
Do you think we have sufficient rules of the road in understanding of each other's thresholds in avoiding escalation in this domain?
I would say no, but space is not unique in that regard. So we're not particularly clear on how people would react or should react with terrestrial incidents, so why should space be any different?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Glenn. We are now very, very pleased to welcome a special storyteller to personify the power of the transatlantic alliance. This one is going to focus not on space security, but very human security. To introduce our storyteller, please welcome NATO's senior civilian representative, to Afghanistan Ambassador Sir Nicholas Kay.
Right, excellent. I thought I was going to be introducing Ariana Saeed, but maybe she'll be coming in a moment, I'm sure. Let me just say, you've been hearing about cyber before, social media. I think space is the next thing. Let's try now to bring you down to real people in real conflict. If I can, let me transport you in Afghanistan back to the year 1996. October 1996. I was there as a young diplomat 4 days after the Taliban arrived in Kabul, captured Kabul. I think I was the first foreign diplomat into Kabul after that. And I thought, well, I better go and see the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I was taken by my embassy to the ministry, and it was in a little bit of disarray. They just had a change of occupants. The old head of protocol there, a lovely gentleman, said, "You'll have to excuse me, sir. The new lot are a little rough around the edges." So I went in and sat and had a meeting with the acting foreign minister, the Taliban acting foreign minister. I had speaking points to make, which were along the lines of, well, now you are running this country, you've captured Kabul, you will be held to the standards of international respect for international conventions, human rights, particularly women's rights. The conversation didn't go very well. He polite, I guess, more or less, but there was absolutely no meeting of minds as I was trying to tell him that if he wanted international recognition for Afghanistan, then respect for women's rights was going to be central to it. Wind the clock forward 20, if I do the math, 21 years, I think. And August 2017, I arrived back in Kabul. The first time I'd been back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as British ambassador, and I went into the ministry, also very spruce now and well run, and went in to present the copy of my credentials to the acting foreign minister. And she, because it was she, a woman, Adela Raz, who is now the Afghan ambassador in New York, was, of course, extremely interested. We had a very, very good conversation. One of her responsibilities in 2017 was women's economic empowerment. And I suddenly thought, my goodness, this is absolutely the night and day transformation that Afghanistan has gone through from the dark days of the Taliban to the days in now when you have a deputy foreign minister responsible for women's economic empowerment. Afghanistan is full of inspiring and courageous men and women of the post-2001 generation. And NATO we primarily, of course, think of it as a defensive alliance, very interested in military matters. But in its founding document in 1949, signed here in London, it said it is an alliance founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And in Afghanistan, the NATO mission since 2003 has very much enabled Afghans now to enjoy and to aspire towards the same rights that we all enjoy. So the hugely inspirational people include very much the young woman that we'll see shortly, Ariana Saeed. I first met a couple of years ago in Kabul. She's very well known, famous. She hosts a TV program there called Afghan Star, which is a bit like Pop Idol. She's an incredibly powerful performer and singer in her own right. And 2 years ago, when I first met her, she had been back in Afghanistan to perform live in a stadium. As a young woman, this is very, very controversial. She received death threats. She was warned by the security not to perform. She ended up not performing actually at the stadium, but she performed at a smaller venue, and later that night I met her as she'd just come back from that concert. She's very impressive, and I would like you to welcome extremely warmly, so she can tell her story far better than I can, Ariana Saeed.
Thank you so much, Sir Nicholas Kay, for the kind introduction. You've honored me. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I say a word, I would like to draw your attention towards a few images, and I would like you to take a guess where and when they're from. Yes, as some of you might have guessed already, this was the Afghanistan of 40 to 50 to 60 years ago, when it was ahead of so many of its neighboring countries and even some parts of the Western world when it came to human and women's rights. But then, unfortunately, we were hit by extremism, backward thinking, war, misery, and terrorism, as a result of which millions of Afghans had to flee the country, and that included my family and I. We first had to go to Pakistan, and from there, believe it or not, I was smuggled out of the country to Switzerland when I was only 12 years old. Our refugee case was rejected in Switzerland, so we came to England, where they gave us a beautiful home and an opportunity to grow. After finishing my studies, I decided to pursue a career in music. But even then, I never thought that someday I would return to Afghanistan, and that too as a female artist. What actually opened my mind towards taking such an unbelievable step was the progress and the change being made inside Afghanistan by the presence of NATO, and the fact that the world was finally paying attention towards Afghanistan. So I took my first trip back to Afghanistan in 2010. And on my way back to Afghanistan, I have to be honest, I was very nervous, and I was quite scared as well. And when I got there, I was suddenly so heartbroken and so sad because of all the poverty and the misery and the sadness around me. However, after performing my first concert in the city of Kabul, I felt and experienced something very amazing. I felt joy, I experienced happiness and positive energy and hope. And that made me realize something so important. It made me realize that with what I do, I can actually leave an impact there, and I can inspire and give hope to a nation that was in need of it. So I decided to stay in Afghanistan, and I started performing major concerts in various different parts of the country, including 3 major concerts in Bamyan. And I performed right in front of the Buddha statue. Yes, the very same Buddha statue that was destroyed by Taliban not so long ago. And these concerts were attended by up to 20,000 people each, which, to be honest, still feels like a dream to me. I performed concerts for fundraising. I performed concerts that were attended by women only. And I tried to give hope wherever I went. One of the major challenges I took upon myself was to perform in the heart of Kabul city at a football stadium, where Taliban used to openly execute women by shooting them in the head in the crowds. it's interesting to see a nightmare turned into hope in the same place. And of course, all these performances would not have been possible without the major security and partial peace of mind provided by the Afghan forces who were actually trained and supported by NATO. To share some of my personal experiences in regards to or related to improvements in the lives of Afghan women. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot that needs to be done in that country. But when I went to Afghanistan first time in 2010, and whenever I looked outside my window and if I saw 100 people out there, for example, only maybe 3 or 4 of them would have been women. But if I look outside today, out of those 100 people, at least 30 to 40 of them are women. Women today have the chance to study. They are working, they're becoming politicians, they're becoming doctors, teachers, and they're even joining the armed forces. And to me, I personally think that these were the first and initial steps that had to be taken for Afghan women to finally have hope for a normal life. Now, I know, ladies and gentlemen, that there are discussions about the international community to walk away and leave Afghanistan, or to potentially reach a deal or a compromise with Taliban. Even though I personally support peace like everyone else does here, but I do not want us to sacrifice or risk the rights of Afghan women or all those achievements or the progress that has been made in that country for the past 20 years. And before I wrap up my story, I would like to take a moment and express my utmost appreciation. I want to express my sincere condolences to all those NATO families who lost their loved ones while serving in Afghanistan. But I want you to know that your sacrifices did not go in vain. That the future generations of Afghanistan finally have hope for a better tomorrow. And before I wrap up, I would like to show you a few more images of the changes and the progress that has been made in Afghanistan. For example, this image that you see, this is actually Kabul city during the Civil War, which is approximately about 25 to 30 years ago. And so is this one, completely destroyed. This is the very historic and famous Dar al-Aman Palace, which was made by King Amanullah Khan, and this was the state of it during the Civil War. This, of course, is the brutal rule of Taliban when they openly beat up, punish, and execute women. And of course, the very sad and unforgettable moment that was seen and heard around the world. Now, once again, I would like to go to the peace negotiations. And as I said, I know there are discussions about the international community to leave Afghanistan. But I wanted to tell you, and by these images, actually, look at this. This is the same Kabul city today. And you saw the same Kabul city, which was from 30 years ago, and it's rebuilt. It may not be as beautiful as London or New York or Paris, but this is the Afghanistan today. And this is the same palace. And I personally think that this is a sign of hope and a rebuilt Afghanistan. And this progress has not just been made in Kabul city, but in the other cities as well, like Mazar, Herat, my personal favorite city, Bamyan, Kandahar, Believe it or not, this is Kandahar, where it used to be the hometown of Taliban. And so is this one. Now, let me repeat again. If you leave and walk away from Afghanistan, I think that Afghanistan will return to civil war, where all those warlords are waiting to start attacking and fighting each other for money and for power. And they will not care about all those millions of innocent souls and lives that will be lost in the process. And Afghanistan will yet again go back to being the home of terrorism. And with the last image, to wrap up my story, I would like to tell you that if you forget and walk away and leave Afghanistan, you will be risking the lives and the future of these beautiful children. Thank you for your attention. I'm Ariana, and I represent today's Afghanistan. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much to Ariana for sharing her stories, and for anyone who knows Afghanistan, they will know the incredible courage that she has demonstrated in managing to forge a career like that and to speak out so strongly on what's happened to her country, how it's transitioned, and how right now, as President Trump has said, talks with the Taliban have resumed. The very real possibility of some kind of deal taking place is back on the table. That warning should be listened to by all of you of the need to make sure that there is an enduring political solution to the situation in Afghanistan that involves everybody and not for NATO to walk away. So we're going to change the tone from what we've just heard in Afghanistan back to the sort of future shape of NATO in different domains. NATO declared cyber a domain a couple of years ago, and we know that it's an area, an offensive and defensive area that troubles all of our countries in terms of cyber attacks happening every day. It's a form of this hybrid warfare that people talk about, and yet most members of the public don't really understand that type of attack that's just under the threshold of all-out war and yet subverts democracy. So we've got a fantastic panel led by Clara Jordan of the Executive Director for the EU and Africa at the Global Cyber Alliance, and she'll be talking about cyber, defense, offense, and hybrid warfare. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome to the stage the Executive Director, EU and Africa, Global Cyber Alliance, Clara Jordan.
Good evening, everyone. Is my mic on? Is my mic on? Yes, good evening, everyone. So it's almost 6 p.m., and I know you've all been waiting to hear the C word. We talked about information warfare, we talked about disinformation, and now we're going to address kind of the last element of what we now call modern warfare. So we have three great panelists here today with us. We have Karen Martin, who is the head of UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, Teija Tikkainen, who is the director of European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, and Max Smeets, who is senior researcher at ETH Zurich's Centre for Security Studies. So the panelists will have 2 minutes to deliver their opening remarks, and I will right after that open for questions to the audience, because I know you all have pressing questions on cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, and everything that has to do with NATO's core mission of defense and deterrence. So the first speaker, Karen, will talk a little bit about kind of what it generally means for cyber, all these new tactics of warfare. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clara. There's a great website called haveibeenpwned.com. It's run by an Australian called Troy Hunt, and it tells you if your personal details have been stolen in a hack. You should look it up because you're probably on it. Now, on that site's past form, in the course of both minutes that Clara has kindly allotted me under pain of severe punishment, in the course of both minutes, their cyber attacks globally will cause 16,200 successful personal identity compromises. And experience suggests very little of this will be nation-state activity of strategic significance. But the attacks will damage our citizens, they fuel crime, and they'll harm prosperity. And I'm mentioning this not to raise awareness. I think certainly in terms of this audience, we're way past the awareness-raising stage. I say it to show we must never forget, first, the link between cybersecurity and digital prosperity, and second, the vulnerabilities inherent in our digital societies. So for me, the absolute prerequisite of changing the rules of the game is to build markedly safer digital homelands across our alliance. NATO has rightly made cyberspace a domain of operations, but cyberspace is first and foremost a peaceful domain. It's not just a platform for our economies and societies these days, it's a fundamental part of them. We live and work online, so we have to keep cyberspace as safe and healthy as possible. Cyber attack capabilities are called viruses for a reason. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a cyber pacifist. The UK was the first country to offer offensive cyber capabilities to NATO, but we're a responsible cyber power. We observe laws and ethical standards that distinguish us from our adversaries. But responsible cyber powers have to use and guard our capabilities carefully. We can't be like the North Koreans with WannaCry or the Russians with NotPetya, launching attacks that spiral out of control with serious unintended consequences. Our free, open societies will always have more to lose from weak defense than our adversaries. We need to make our attackers work harder. Some will be deterred by this. We have to accept others will not, so we need to stop them succeeding. To change the game, even taking to the field requires much better defense.
Thank you very much, Karen. So now we're going to move to you, Taya. Tell us a little bit about the hybrid warfare aspect of challenges posed to the alliance, internally or externally, from where you stand at the Center of Excellence.
Thank you so much. I will start with the very basic question concerning why exactly are hybrid threats, hybrid warfare, other forms of hybrid action, why are they so difficult for the target country? We know that it is a phenomenon, hybrid warfare, that operates in the grey zone. It's nothing that we know from other conventional contexts. It is warfare in the grey zone between war and peace. It's hybrid action between the domestic sphere and the foreign sphere. It is information between information and disinformation. So by nature, these hybrid threats are such that it's very difficult for a target country to decide which exactly are the instruments with which it should counter this phenomenon. Also, the normative framework is very unclear. What are the rights and duties applying to such a phenomenon? What are the rights of the targeted country when it's not exactly the typical form of warfare? This element of confusion is a thing that makes this phenomenon very difficult. It is also very difficult for the alliance, NATO, because the means used are not the standard used forms of military aggression. We know that it is attacks against critical infrastructure, it is attacks against the information environment, it is forms of aggression that don't fall into the fields of NATO's competencies, its tasks. So this is a difficulty for NATO, because when we compare the forms of aggression with any other types of traditional aggression, it is a question of essential threat in this case, but it is very much more difficult for the alliance to find the proper responses from the instruments at its disposal. Still, I would like to argue that NATO has sent a political signal to any adversaries. It is exactly as stated by the colleague here. It has defined the cyber domain as one of its operational domains, the cyber element being one instrument for hybrid action. NATO has done a lot also in the broader hybrid field, and the Center of Excellence that I represent forms one part of that agenda where NATO and EU cooperate and try to find joint means to this phenomenon. I want to conclude with deterrence. If we want to respond in our traditional vocabulary, if we want to respond to aggression, deterrence is a well-known instrument there. Why is deterrence so difficult in a hybrid environment? It is being used by building resilience of our societies. NATO is doing that. It also provides a very important political framework for its member states in terms of deterrence by denial. Signal is sent to the adversary. But we also have the other form of deterrence called deterrence by punishment, which is a stronger form of deterrence. NATO has stressed that it is its willingness to, if needed, use the Article 5, activate Article 5 in a hybrid threat scenario or hybrid threat case. But we also do need to take into account that it's not easy for an alliance with those values as NATO has to use similar instruments as the adversaries use. So deterrence by punishment is difficult also in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this kind of ties it very well to Max. We talked about different instruments that NATO has. We talked about, deterrence by punishment or deterrence by action. I'd love to hear, how you think about how the use of offensive cyber effects within the alliance falls into the defense and deterrence and the overall mission of the alliance.
Yeah. So last year, NATO reached a landmark that went largely unnoticed. There are now more member states which have publicly established a military cyber command or similar unit than there are member states which have not. As my fellow panelists said, there are several countries which have offered sovereign cyber effects to NATO missions and the alliance. And of course, at the Brussels summit, member states reiterated the cyber defense pledge and officially established the Cyber Operations Center to be fully operational in 2023. But we shouldn't confuse declaratory policy and even institutional development with an actual meaningful cyber capability. I wouldn't say it's all bark and no bite, but there are certainly too many problems at both the national and NATO level to believe that NATO will be effectively engaging in cyberspace the coming years. Just to put it in context, many of the military cyber commands were established between 2012 and 2014, after Stuxnet, but also at a time of austerity and severe defense budget cuts. Like, cyber was very much seen as a way to stay at the military forefront of war fighting and modern war fighting at a relatively small price. But as we realize today, that's actually not the case. Going cyber is actually pretty hard. For example, it continues to be very difficult to recruit talent. to retain talent. When it comes to exploit and tool development, it's challenging, especially because of the uncertainty of lifespan. And even within nation states, when we think about intelligence sharing between intelligence agencies and military cyber commands, we see an enormous amount of challenges. And lastly, as was said, still many of the strategic questions remain unanswered. It's still not clear to what degree cyber deterrence is an effective strategy at all, especially in a space where we are already constantly engaging, where we are not even trying to dissuade the adversary from conducting a certain activity because they're already doing so on a constant basis. There are many other questions. Think about to what degree we can use offensive cyber operations as maybe a counter force or even a counter value option.
Thank you, Max. So Max highlighted some of the progress and some of the challenges. I'll ask my first question in a minute, but I'll start to ask for a raise of hands for questions. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about the progress, and NATO has made significant progress. If you think about it, and in 2012, it was the first time NATO said, oh, we need to strengthen our cyber capabilities. NATO was in a phase of awareness. You know, then in 2016, we talked about cyber as a domain of operations. And we're now in 2019 talking about using sovereign cyber effects. So what do you think is next in terms of really operationalizing the capabilities offered? What do you think NATO has to do as a next step in this space? Any of the three?
Please. Well, so it starts, of course, at the national level, right? Again, as we've been mentioned a couple of times today, it's not NATO who owns most of the capabilities. And there, when we think about what we see at the national level, first of all, it's, as a military commander said, it's about people, people, and people. And we have made mistakes in the past. Many of these military cyber commands were established, and we're recruiting people from a variety of other military forces. So you basically brain drain from all those other military forces some of your most important IT talent, and then what you do, you provide a perfect recruitment platform for private sector companies who are also in dire need of that talent to recruit from. So you're actually losing a lot of the capabilities that you want. So one is, of course, continuing to invest in that. Now that comes, of course, with huge problems. Not least, it's very difficult to replicate talent. Many of the skills, the most important skills of operators, developers, and system administrators were retained at simply working together on GitHub, doing some code sharing, going to a conference, going to another hacker event. It's going to be really tough to put that kind of in a formal training program. But today, many of the training programs are literally 3 to 9 months long, and then they're pushed into a cyber command. We have to do better. We have to invest much more in that. And I think that's also a space where many of the NATO members can work together and are not doing that enough right now.
That's great. So let's start with the first question here. Then the gentleman.
Thank you. My name is George. I'm the Information and Cybersecurity Consultant and representing Georgia. My question is regarding the Article 5 and its invocation when it comes to the cyber. So, as you mentioned, there are too many unclarities and some blurry things regarding the cyber issues. But as we see, like almost 3 years, like NATO officially declared the cyber as a operating domain. So there are huge problems, there are huge issues regarding the attribution, regarding the proportional response, regarding the consequence and the magnitude of the attacks and so on. So I will not go into details. One thing, what I really think that it should be like the baseline and it should be start from that. So the Article 5, which is based on the armed attack notion, yeah? So how do you think, how long it will take to determine and to just to set the clear and strict determination of the armed attack in the cyber? Because all we hear about the armed attack should be like case by case, and we should just decide case by case the things, but it really brings more unclarities when it comes to the cyber. So how do you think when it's possible to have the clear and strict notion of armed attack in the cyber? It's not an easy question, yeah, I know.
No, I think it's a hugely difficult question, but a very important one. And I wonder whether there is a political will within the allies to make or agree on such a strict definition of when, what kind of an attack does it need to be. Also from the hybrid perspective, the cyber instrument is used in concert with many other tools, critical infrastructure attacks. And it might also be that it is a combination of attacks simultaneously that triggers the use of the Article 5, but I think I don't see any great willingness. Perhaps colleagues know more about a definition of when the threshold exactly is reached.
You know, and before giving a floor to Max, I'll just say that states have a huge responsibility to talk about their understanding of international law, and there are many states who has done it. I think the UK's Attorney General recently talked about the UK's understanding of how international law applies to cyber. I mean, it's up to each member state to talk about that, and that's how you kind of create the understanding of what it would be. That would facilitate answering those questions. Max?
Yeah, and it's not just about being unclear about red lines and when Article 5 is triggered, but it's also how we would respond in those cases. And this uncertainty, some have argued, leads to more deterrence, right? The adversary is not entirely clear on when and how we will respond, and hence doesn't do so, which stands in stark contrast to many of the discussions that we had during the Cold War, particularly in relation to nuclear weapons, where we famously talked about the crystal ball effect that led to deterrence. It was the certainty of a certain effect that would be caused, the enormous havoc that would be caused after it, that led to a certain amount of deterrence. Having said that, I actually don't think that the biggest problem is when Article 5 is triggered or not. It is exactly the issues that we've mentioned here today. It is all that activity that is taking place below the threshold of armed attack, yet is still strategically meaningful. And that is something that NATO is grappling with today, and how to respond to that.
Anyone there?
Thanks, Lara. Pete Cooper, Atlantic Council. At the heart of NATO's collective action is the ability to conduct joint operations, multi-domain, multinational, at speed, and across a large geographic area. With space and cyber as new domains of operation, is it now time for NATO nations to start considering what force construct and C2 looks like for parity across all of these different domains, if it's to maintain the ability to conduct agile operations and maintain workforce?
Take that?
Sure. So it's a dangerous one. Of course, every country now needs to operate at as quick as they can and have freedom to maneuver, or what the US Cyber Command recently proposed is to operate continuously, globally, and seamlessly. The danger in this space is that it is, and particularly cyberspace I'm now talking about, is that it is not like conventional domains, right? So when General Nakasone talks about also defending forward in cyberspace, like our navies are not patrolling or not at the harbor, but also patrolling at the sea, it's very different in cyberspace. The moment you go outside of your own networks, you're into someone else's networks. And that's a big difference, especially when we move away from not just being in allied networks, potentially as an ally for kind of observing reasons, for espionage, but also doing this for effects reasons, to be a disruptor, to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy. And we've seen particularly the US moving in that direction with its recent strategy of persistent engagement and defend forward, arguing that they need to cause friction wherever the adversary maneuvers, but that area could also be allied networks.
I would just add to that, and I agree entirely with what Max just said. If you're looking at things from the perspective of a senior military commander and thinking about potential operations, you will ask the question like that, and you will be framing your capabilities in that sort of way. If you're in charge, as I am, of the national cyber defence of the country, including strategic capabilities, including helping the Ministry of Defence protect armed forces capabilities, but you're actually also trying to protect the digital environment of an advanced economy, you have to take a much more nuanced and social and subtle approach, thinking about those networks that you're traversing on, thinking about the fact that most of the threatening activity will fall way below law of armed conflict, triggering Article 5 and so forth, thinking about, frankly, the commercial and economic realities of what you're doing. So, yes, of course, in terms of thinking of the future of NATO as a military alliance, these sorts of issues will evolve, but thinking about us as an alliance of like-minded advanced digital economies, we have to think in a different way as well.
So let's start with questions. The young lady at the back, please, and then we'll have a microphone back there for the next question, and then at the back.
Thank you, Lura Quain, researcher at the IEA in Dublin. I have a question with regard to human resources and talent, the market failure that you mentioned, Max, which is quite relevant. So how can you actually reconcile the disparate resources, or the resources gap as such, both the private sector and in the States? There's a brain drain at present, go away from the brain death comment, and how can we actually find common ground and, essentially consolidating reputational risk, which is a common interest for both states and for private sector? Thank you.
You want to talk a little bit about what you've done for the talent at your centre?
Yeah, I don't like pessimism about cyber skills. I mean, we've got what we've got, and a lot of us, a lot of countries represented in the Alliance are doing okay. We need to defend digital homelands better. We need elite defenders, but we need good enough defenders, and we need elite military capabilities. We also need ones that are necessary for just persistent engagement, defending forward, and so on. So let's not be overly pessimistic on this. We're trying to, in the UK, build two pipelines, if you like. The elite pipeline, intervening at a very early age in the school system, particularly in the female half of the population that's woefully underestimated on all sides of the cyber skills spectrum. Career paths in national security, but we include in that industry, and so forth. But then just looking at, for the vast majority of people in any of the societies across the Alliance, we will not be looking to most people to wake up every day and think about cybersecurity or think about contesting cyberspace. We'll ask them to think about something else that's of national value, and we need to train them to be, even if it's just getting their phone out of the pocket after the meeting, to be digitally savvy. And that's a completely different skill set. And so that starts partly with the education system, it starts partly with large-scale training programs, but it starts partly with incentives, with regulation to get that right. It's a full national ecosystem, and I wouldn't be as pessimistic as sometimes the general consensus on this implies.
Thank you. The question at the back, please.
Piret Kuzik, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, ICDS. How should we approach the thinking or the question on whether NATO is the fit format for these challenges? Where does the line go? Does NATO have to fight financial crime? And how do you decide that line? Thank you.
I think NATO certainly belongs to the key actors, in my view, in the field, because by taking responsibility in this threat environment, NATO shows that it is capable of adjusting to changing conditions, and this is certainly what it tries to do. It's also the defense alliance of its member states, and when the threats are changing, it's adjusting. But of course, in this environment, it cannot protect its member states alone. It has been pointed out here that cooperation with EU, but also cooperation with private sector actors in this threat environment is more and more important. So partnerships of new type will be necessary for NATO, but still I think with regard to its basic treaty and the obligations there, it is the one that takes this responsibility, and it should do.
Yeah, it certainly has an important responsibility, but we shouldn't, as you may be referring to, militarize all the problems, right? And so it's a difficult balance, and I think we see this with the questions such as resilience too, where of course depending on the specifics and what type of resilience we're talking about, maybe resilience against cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, or resilience, as the previous panel talked about, disinformation operations, where we address very different entities. We need to be aware of where NATO kind of stops and ends, and as much as I see an important role for NATO, there is a danger of kind of overextending that too.
So we'll take the last question there at the back, Sven.
Thank you. I'm Sven Zakov, International Center for Defense and Security, a think tank in Tallinn, Estonia, formerly at NATO Cyber Center of Excellence. And two short comments. First is on deterrence in cyberspace. One of the speakers said that he's not sure whether it works in a cyberspace. I don't think there is any reason why it should work in a cyberspace. In the same way as if a land threat is not to be deterred only on land, it has to be a multi-domain deterrence. And the second comment is on a threshold of Article 5 for cyber attack. I mean, essentially, Article 5 is always a political determination. And I think what the leaders will look at that is the effect of attack, not the domain through which it materialized. So I would say that if a cyber attack blew up a nuclear power station, effect of that would be catastrophic, and I think then this is over threshold. Otherwise, setting a threshold on such a matter invites adversaries to play just below it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any last reaction? Let's do a quick round of...
A couple of quick responses. Firstly, on the pragmatism about your approach to Article 5, I think that must be right, and it goes wider than that. When I started the National Cybersecurity Centre and was planning for what sort of major incidents we'd have to respond to, I'm not making an Article 5 point here. We didn't predict that our first one would be a North Korean ransomware attack that went wrong and hit the health service in this country, and I think we could model all sorts of things that might test Article 5, and then reality will contradict you. And I think on the wider point about deterrence, some people will be deterred, some people will have to work harder and they'll give up. But some people won't be deterred, and particularly as we worry about proliferation of cyber tools, which I think is one of the big strategic issues of the 2020s. We've just got to make sure that the attacks don't work.
Any last comments?
Well, from the hybrid environment perspective, I want to stress that cyber realm and cyber field is one of the instruments that are being used there. And the difficulty with this hybrid environment is that when a set of instruments are being used simultaneously, it's a huge challenge, as we all know, to a society, and that's why we need all of these systems of cooperation. Also, it's an interesting question whether including something in the tasks of NATO currently means a militarization of the issue. This is perhaps something that we need to think about. With regard to the cyber approach of NATO as well, it's quite far from its original tasks with these duties.
Last 10 seconds, Max.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to be overly pessimistic or negative about NATO's developments, and I just wanted to quote Ambassador Soren de Caro, who is also sitting here in the room, who said a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago, talking about offensive cyber used to be kind of blasphemy. You wouldn't talk about it at all. We were talking about within NATO about cyber defense until maybe 3-4 years ago, but certainly not cyber offense. And so we've come a long way, and we may have still a long way to go, but that's important to keep in mind.
Well, join me in thanking the panelists for this very informative 30 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for sticking with us till the further into this day. A lot of today has been thinking about a few things. One of them is the transatlantic relationship and the position of the United States. The other one is about the future of the alliance and where it goes. What will this discussion look like when NATO celebrates its centenary? I think it's appropriate, having discussed this incredible range of issues, space, cyber, Baltic, Black Sea, all sorts of fascinating issues, that we come back to some of these basics. And so we are rounding off on a very, very important note, a perspective from the future of the alliance. To give us a sense of where we go and to root that discussion, we have Ambassador Nick Burns, who of course was US Ambassador to NATO, a senior US diplomat, and is now at Harvard University. Ambassador Burns will pave the way for our final speaker, who is one of the most impressive 15-year-olds you will hear. Olivia Seltzer, through her publication, is helping young people everywhere think about global affairs and current affairs, global affairs and current events that impact our lives today and tomorrow. Ambassador Burns will share her background in a moment, but for now, please join me in welcoming him.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nick Burns. It's a pleasure to be here. On 9/11, I was a very new American ambassador to NATO. I'd been there for 10 days. And when we were hit hard, 3,000 people dead in New York City and Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., my phone started to ring. The Canadian ambassador, the French ambassador to NATO, the UK ambassador, the Dutch ambassador. We want to help. What can we do? And within 12 hours, we had decided to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. An attack on one is an attack on all. And I can tell you, it was an emotional day, because Americans are not accustomed to being on the defensive, not accustomed to terrorist attacks on the scale of 9/11. All of our NATO allies stood up that day, and they supported us. It was emotional, and I felt grateful, and I feel grateful now. And that's why I support NATO, because Americans shouldn't want to live alone in the world. We're powerful, but we can't defeat climate change on our own, and we have to defeat climate change. We can't arrest war on our own. We can't get much of anything done without Britain, without France, without Germany, without Greece. I'm grateful to NATO. And so when our president said today, President Trump, here in London, the United States doesn't get much out of NATO, I thoroughly disagree. The United States of America depends on our allies. We depend on our allies. And the only way we can create a just world, a peaceful world, which we should all want, especially the younger people here I'm seeing in great numbers, a safe world, is to stay together in this terrific alliance. And by the way, after 9/11, when the NATO allies invoked Article 5, they sent their troops to Afghanistan. The NATO allies and their partners have suffered over 1,000 combat deaths, several thousand wounded, and they're still there today. So as an American, I wanted to come here tonight to London to say thank you to the British people, to the French people, and to the peoples of the NATO alliance. We have to be hopeful about the future. And there's a 15-year-old young woman here from Santa Barbara High School, in the most beautiful town in the United States, I think, Santa Barbara, California. If you haven't visited, you should. She has started a group called The Cram. She's trying to get young kids interested in being active, in being in the arena, in standing up for what they believe in, and registering to vote. And I want to introduce you to her because she's a member of Generation Z, Gen Z, and she gives my hope that younger people can lead us forward. So please join me in welcoming Olivia Seltzer. Welcome, Olivia.
Thank you.
This is the NATO Death Star, as we call it.
Thank you. I would like to start off by introducing you to my generation. We are young, between the ages of 4 and 24. We spend an average of 7 hours on our phones each day. We are the most ethnically diverse generation yet. We go by many names: the I generation, the founding generation, the Hamilton, yes, Hamilton is in the musical, generation. But mostly, we go by Generation Z. There's a running joke among Gen Zers that we are just stuck in this constant state of panic and depression, that we experience this never-ending sense of impending doom. And I think that's really a feeling that's been instilled in us from the very beginning. It's something I've tried verbalizing to my parents a number of times. We have grown up in a post-9/11 world where terror attacks are, at times, a daily occurrence, where school shootings, at least in the United States, are expected among almost every student, where climate change is always looming, a ticking clock that seems far too quiet, threatening our futures. In fact, it's estimated that in about a decade, we will have run out of time to halt the effects of climate change. I will be 25. My kindergarten class at my public elementary school was twice the size of nearly every other grade. Our classrooms were bursting at the seams. We were in the middle of a recession, and few families could afford private schools. I was single digits when the first iPhone came out. Since then, there have been countless studies on the effects technology and social media have on our still developing brains. I live in a world where cyberbullying is rampant, and mental illness claims more and more victims. So I think it's very fitting that my generation is Generation Z, the last generation. But my generation's story is not only one of pain and loss and suffering. My generation's story is one of hope. Because despite all this, despite the million different things so terribly wrong with our world, things that only seem to be getting so much worse, studies show my generation continues to be more optimistic than any other. Yes, really. Now let me tell you my story. My great-grandparents were Jews living in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. In the early 1900s, they were forced to flee due to the pogroms, or mass killings of Jews. As refugees, they searched for a new home. Only 3 countries offered to take them in: Mexico, Cuba, and Argentina. My great-grandparents decided to escape to Mexico City and gave birth to my grandfather, Oscar. His first languages were Yiddish and Spanish. He would go on to speak 7. When he was in his early 20s, Oscar immigrated to the United States, where he illegally overstayed his visa. So my family story is not just one of refugees and religious persecution, but also one of undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens. Oscar eventually gained citizenship and made a life for himself in Los Angeles, where he and his wife, the granddaughter of Jews who had also fled the Soviet Union, gave birth to my father. I never met Oscar. He passed away before I was born. But his legacy lives on in my younger brother, who carries his name. My family now lives in Santa Barbara, California. I've never been to Mexico, nor Russia. But my family's story has connected me to the world in unimaginable ways. Right now, immigration is one of the most talked about and controversial topics in the world. And in the United States, hate crimes are on the rise, with the majority targeting Jews. I'm not alone in this connection. When the 2016 US presidential election took place, there was a palpable sense of fear at my junior high school. The majority of the students are Latinx, and many of their parents are undocumented immigrants from Central America. So there was the sense that what was happening in our government was impacting us all in a very big way. After the results came out, all anyone could talk about was the election. As someone who has always been very political, I was even more activated by this event. And I could see that others were too. The election exposed the massive interest my generation has in the news and in politics. But there was an equally massive problem. My generation wasn't reading or watching the news, which left this massive interest without an outlet. It's not hard to understand why. If you read the news, any news, the reporters and journalists are all going to be adults. Similarly, their intended reader is not going to be someone of my age group. Try watching the news, and you'll see ads for fighting hair loss. While that might be a problem for me eventually, it's certainly not one now. And that's because, yet again, no one is expecting someone of my age to be consuming the news. This creates media that's completely inaccessible for teens and young adults, not just because the news is not intended for us, but also because, unfortunately, it's not very understandable or engaging for my generation. I saw this as a huge problem for a variety of reasons. Every day, something goes on in the world that affects countless lives. And if we don't know about these things, we're doing a serious disservice to the people being affected for a very big reason. You can't change the world unless you know about it. Meaning, how can we be expected to create change if we don't even know where change needs to be made? The short answer is, you can't. That's why, in February of 2017, I founded the solution, the Cram. Each morning, I wake up at 5 a.m. to read the news, create relevant stories, and rewrite them in a way that relates and connects to 13 to 30-year-olds. Then, I send it out in a quick, informational, and witty email or text. Our mission is to educate and activate, and our subscribers come from over 80 countries all over the world. Our monthly viewership is over 1 million. And you'll find this: recognizing a problem, creating a solution, is a common theme among Gen Zers. Because, yes, we are the last generation. We feel we are the last line of defense to solve the countless problems facing our world. But we are not standing idly by. We are not twiddling our thumbs. This sense of urgency has turned us all, myself included, into activists. And the interesting thing about this is how creative and innovative we've had to become in our activism. Many of us can't yet vote, so we raise our voices even louder in the hope that those who can will listen. We strike, we protest, we organize, we take to social media, we invent, we found organizations and charities. We do everything we can to ensure our future children won't have to fight, too. So we've established that Gen Z recognizes the problems facing our world. We've established that we see hope in ourselves and how we continue to fight. But how does any of this tie in with NATO? I turned to my Gen Z readers to find out. 75% thought they knew what NATO is, but some thought it had to do with trade, or maybe even got it confused with NAFTA. One Gen Zer thought it was a women's group. Of those who did know what NATO is, 86% thought it was necessary. The 14% who didn't were, interestingly enough, comprised of leading youth activists. And furthermore, those who did know what NATO is knew very, very little, on average ranking their knowledge a 2 out of 10. 76% of those who did know what NATO is did not think NATO does enough to address world issues. But alternately, almost no one knew that NATO counts environmental safety and climate change as some of its focuses. The biggest overarching theme I saw was one of disconnect. And here is my theory on why. My generation is young. We are used to being locked out of the system due to our age. And I think that's led to a sense of moving on, of, oh, we can't get involved here, so we need to find a different path. When asked what NATO can do to better engage young people, the answer was simple. Come to us. We are here. We are waiting. All we want is for older generations to listen and take action. We are doing the work. We are gathered en masse in classrooms and on social media. We want to get involved, so give us a way. Give us opportunities to become part of the conversation at NATO, precisely like you're doing by having me up on the stage here today. Educate us, on and offline. The most common response I saw was to access my generation through social media. The work you are doing is relevant, but we just don't know about it. Or, moreover, as with traditional media, we feel it isn't accessible or intended for us. And if you want to know how to respond to these issues we so deeply care about, such as climate change and gun control, you have immense power. You are the policymakers, the world leaders. As much as we protest and organize and create, at the end of the day, our fate is in your hands. We only hope you care as much as we do. Thank you.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation, particularly for that very personal view. Before we have you run away from us, if we could pose another question to you. You listened to lots of the conversation we had this morning and this afternoon. Did you feel anything was missing as we look ahead, we look at the next iteration of this, and the next time we have these discussions? What struck you as absent, or what struck you as missing in our talks?
I thought it was really great that so many of the speakers we heard actually did talk about young people and actually included young people in what they were speaking about. But I think the one thing that I felt was missing was that they were saying that they wanted young people to get involved, which is great. Of course, I want young people to get involved. But from my perspective, we already are involved. We already, as I mentioned in my speech, we already are doing the work. But we feel like this isn't being reciprocated from government officials, that they're not coming to us and wanting to work with us and actually listening to what we have to say. So I would say that was the one thing I felt was missing, was the recognizing that we already are doing these different things and getting involved and taking action. But we would like for people to start listening.
That's a fantastic takeaway for the officials in this room, who I'm sure will be listening very carefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And really incredible to think at 15 to be putting up a website like that. I remember when I was 15, I got to do work experience on the Aldershot News. So we're reaching the end of what I hope you've all agreed it was a fantastic day. We thought we'd take you back to that question we posed right at the very beginning when we were testing the app out, about what you thought NATO's main focus should be focuses in the future. And I think we've got the question and hopefully answers, if technology has not thwarted us. Oh, there we go. So it looks like all of the above. Okay, that's kind of slightly boring, is the answer. Well done, everyone. You got it right. And I guess we were going to ask, over the course of the day, has your opinion changed at all? And we were going to redo the app to see if it had. Actually, let's see if it might go up a bit, I suppose, or down. So do you want to try again with your app and answer that question again and see if maybe your opinion has changed or not, and we can have a look and compare. But
it's a fascinating result, isn't it? In a period in which we have an American defence strategy that explicitly talks about the return of great power competition, about officials talk about ending 18 years of smaller conflicts, that we still see, in this room at least, a sense of the importance of some of those missions. There's not a sense of weariness in the same way as one might expect. But let's see how the discussion over the day may have changed some of that.
I'm not 100% sure how this works. Do we look now?
I think we can see the results now.
Okay, exciting.
I'm aware not everyone may have had time to...
You're probably on the edge of your seat.
Yeah.
I would be if I had a seat. Oh, there you go. Wow. It's gone up.
Not consistent. Yeah.
Okay, well done. Even more people are correct. Well, that's good. So we've had an effect. And I think for me, the takeaways from today are obviously the people speaking on the panels are huge supporters of the alliance. And we've had a really strong championing cry for transatlantic defence. But I think also we've had a lot of wake-up calls, not just Macron's, about how NATO needs to adapt. Yes, it's fantastic that here we are, 70 years of transatlantic defence, but given the changing nature of war and given the changing dynamics in power shifts across the world, NATO really needs to think quickly and adapt if we're going to, well, our successors are going to be in a forum like this in 70 years' time.
I think what jumps out at me is this very powerful sense that we're dealing with a period in which there's obviously significant, very vibrant discussion about the future of the alliance that's shaped in many ways by changes in the domestic politics of member states, including waves of populism sweeping across different parts of the world. But that conversation, that discussion, is being additionally stressed by changes in the core business of what NATO does, which is that it's a military alliance. It has to prepare for conflict. but the nature of conflict or the character of war is also changing. We're seeing things that may stress the speed of conflict, may stress decision makers, the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of missiles that can travel at over Mach 5 and stress existing defensive systems. We're seeing changes in the way precision missiles can target big platforms. So the political issues and the political challenges that we face are being doubly stressed by all of those technological shifts that are also changing the future force structures of armed forces, the equipment they need, the way they fight, the sorts of officers they train. And so this isn't just about the question of, is it about Russia, is it about terrorism, is it about the Baltics, is it about the Black Sea? This is in a more fundamental way about what does conflict look like over the next 70 years, because it definitely will not look like the sorts of structures that NATO had at its founding or in the decades afterwards.
Yeah, I agree. And we were thinking maybe we should ask you if anyone wants to talk or offer their thoughts after today, given that it is all about engaging. So is anyone brave enough to stick a hand up and offer their thoughts? Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. I like you.
Once again, I'm George from Georgia, and I'm the Information and Cybersecurity Consultant. Of course, I will have some takeaway, and I will just have some advice to the NATO countries and to the alliance regarding there was talk about the research and development within the technology and innovating the alliance and so on. So, from my perspective, what I've seen, like recent 3-4 years when the cyber was declared as the operation domain, NATO is being a bit closed and a bit not much open to the research and to not much open to the some educational bodies and agencies. So I would suggest why not to give more chance to the aspirant countries and give more possibilities to be engaged and to be involved in NATO issues, to get closer much to NATO. I mean, the Ukraine and Georgia, of course, the first aspirant countries that we have right now, so almost 10 years and more. So there are really good capabilities within these. I work within the research on the Article 5 as well and so on. Yes, so giving more possibilities to the aspirant countries to be engaged in NATO, especially in R&D within the cyber. That's my takeaway from this.
Thank you. Thank you.
We had a question down here, the lady at the front.
Thank you so much. Cornelia Adriana Baciu, Johns Hopkins University, Washington, D.C. campus. So one of my takeaways, I think, from this conference today is related to the major topic, which is that of the innovating the alliance. So I think this goes beyond of the technological aspect. When we are talking about innovating the alliance, we also refer to processes of innovation, of institutional innovation at strategic level. So I think this could be 2 key points which we would need to develop and advance in future discussions. A second thing which I would like to mention is when we talk about the future of NATO, my research is on evolutionary stable strategies, so I deal a lot with theories. One possibility to conceptualize the future of NATO would be to apply the alliance theory. The alliance theory predicts that the alliance strength will depend on 3 major factors: common threats, mutual utility, and mutual reliability. So I think this could be a possible starting point to aim to conceptualize future challenges and visions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we've got the lady here.
Thank you very much. Helena Melikishvili, political scientist. So I think I was very much inspired by Olivier's presentation, and I would add to George's point, I think it's about new ideas, letting in new ideas and new members as well. And because NATO was a product of new perceptions 70 years ago, I think it's time to let these new ideas in and allow new people to bring their own vision. Thank you.
We have a question over here. If you could wait for the microphone, we'll just get you one.
Yeah, mine would be short too. I'm Sayın Yılmaz from Young Atlantic Treaty Association, Turkey. What I get from this conference is that I think the partner countries and member countries of NATO is pretty much aware of the problems that our alliance facing with, especially in recent years. But then there are some amazing ideas to solve problems, but we need executive solutions in order to make us united even stronger than before, because we have even more different voices within the alliance than we used to have. So yeah, when I turn back, I will definitely try my best to have solutions and create policy papers about those people. But yeah, thank you so much for this lovely event.
Thank you. And thank you ever so much to the audience for being such fantastic participants. Oh, sorry, one more. Yeah, sure, go on.
I'm Catherine Langley Hope from Canada. I'm the Vice Chair of the NATO Association of Canada. I think what all of us need to do is support our Atlantic Councils and our associations, and when we do that, we'll reach out to everyone. We need that support for education and funding, and therefore to reach out to young people and include them.
Thank you very much. So our last job is to say thank you. Thank you to you for all coming here and being engaged. Thank you to the organisers who put this fantastic event on, including, of course, NATO. Thank you as well to the speakers and the panellists and the moderators and everyone behind the scenes who's made this event possible.
And finally, please join us for a very well-deserved drink and follow-on chat downstairs. Thank you.